Pronounced, defined, used in lexical dispatch. Auxiliary or auxiliary, adjective and noun, offering or giving help. Ancillary, supplementary, supporting, an aide, a sailing vessel with an engine. An auxiliary verb. Consensus, noun, a generally accepted opinion or decision among a group of people. Unanimity. It is impossible to make a blanket statement as to what level of auxiliary aids or modifications are required in the integrated program. Throughout its history, it has depended on its auxiliary ships, a generic term used in referring to the many different types of ships used to support the fleet. Mr. Takayama volunteers as an auxiliary fireman, and he helped save my house when it was burning. Home auxiliary power is the initial expected application for fuel cells, followed by applications in transportation. These interactions cause traits in the personality to be dominant, inferior, auxiliary, and tertiary. Because of the heavy workload, he plans to ask the church for an auxiliary or assistant bishop. Usually the list of state assets offered for privatization consists of auxiliary or ineffective enterprises and unprofitable public facilities. The gold standard is an explicitly defined set of auxiliary variables that affiliated companies include in their survey questionnaires. The auxiliary forms of need are used primarily in present tense questions, negations, and conditional clauses. Unlike can and may, auxiliary need has no form for the past tense like could and might. There are 3 auxiliary verbs in English: be, do, and have. Auxiliary verbs come before main verbs. If you want more illumination or need specialty lights, you should investigate the auxiliary lights available from a variety of aftermarket suppliers. The answer is presumed to lie in different levels of complication amongst the relationships between auxiliary assumptions and phenomena. If you want to see a consensus statement on IQ by people in the field, I think the APA statement in response to the bell curve is a pretty good summary. It is not the goal of climate dialogue to reach a consensus, but to stimulate the discussion. That could be critical, and it would be ideal if a consensus could be reached given the globalized nature of the world today. Look around. That's the consensus of most of your readers, and pretty darn obvious. It is decided by the consensus of experts working in a particular field of study. All too often, we are too afraid to have that contrarian view to go against the consensus. There is no consensus as to whether this kind of inducement is unacceptable. This workshop report contains no recommendations, findings, or statements of consensus. Instead, this workshop report summarizes the views expressed by invited speakers and guests. It took constitutional reform and a national consensus to trigger a paradigm shift that can identify existing capacities and begin the process that creates a genuinely powerful regional force. Disagreements between coders for all categories were reviewed and resolved by consensus. There is inherently a greater degree of certainty in a scientific consensus than in an ethical consensus, because science is based on evidence while ethics is based on reasoning. Is your statement corroborated by the vast majority of doctors or by scientific consensus?